The James Webb Space Telescope is rightfully capturing all the headlines this week, but we thought we could bring your attention to one of the unsung heroes of scientific space programs, the Landsat program, which celebrates its 50th anniversary this week.
That's right, you might not be familiar with its name, but you absolutely will be aware of its work. And we're joined by Dr. Jim Irons, the former director of the Earth Science Division at NASA Goddard, and Dr. Jeff Masek, Landsat 9 project scientist since 2015.
What's your favorite scientific space program? Let us know on our social media pages at Space and Things 1 on Twitter and at Space and Things Podcast on Instagram and Facebook, or via the contact form on our website.
And don't forget to leave us a review or drop us a rating if your podcast platform allows it. It really helps us out. But right now, enjoy episode 98 of the Space and Things podcast.
Oh my God! Unbelievable, but it is right to touch.
You are listening to Space and Things with Dave Giles and Emily Carney.
I'm Emily Carney.
And I'm Dave Giles, and welcome to episode 98 of the Space and Things podcast. Things may sound a little bit different today because Emily's not at home. She's elsewhere.
Yes, I am house sitting for my sister this week. So I brought my base here for now. Really good week, just hanging out with my family. And
nice.
As usual, busy with Celestis' next flights that are coming up.
Oh, when is the next one?
We have the Aurora flight, which is coming up on November 30th. That's a suborbital flight from New Mexico. And I'm really excited about that because that'll be Phil Chapman's first space flight.
Oh, wow.
Yes, I am so happy about it. And then we have the Enterprise flight, the Tranquility flight, the Excelsior flight, and I think the Destiny flight, which is a lunar mission. So we've got like 5 space flights coming up in the next year or so. So I'm going to be a little busy.
Yeah, that's pretty exciting, though. Right, before we get into today's topic, you've written an article this week, which does link in really nicely with what we're talking about today. So give us a little bit of a synopsis of that one, and I'll put it in the show notes as always.
Yeah, it kind of links in. It talks about the Landsat program and how during the 1980s, there was actually briefly a plan to rescue and fix a Landsat satellite utilizing the space shuttle. I did not know about this. You know, I wanted to write something about Landsat because it's such an underrated program and it really deserves a moment in the spotlight. I stumbled upon an article and it discussed about how they were going to try to rescue one with the shuttle at one point. I was like, whoa, I had no idea. So I did a little deeper digging. I thought that was so cool. So, yep, I wrote a little bit about it.
Well, that really does link in very nicely with what we're about to talk about, doesn't it?
Yes, let's crack on. So let's introduce this week's main topic. On July 23rd, 1972, Landsat 1 was launched from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. At the time, it was called the Earth Resources Technology Satellite, or ERTS, and it was the first Earth-observing satellite to be launched with the express intent to study and monitor our planet's land masses. Currently in orbit, we have Landsat 7, 8, and 9, and it remains the longest-running program of satellite imagery on Earth and provides a unique resource for those who want to observe global change over the last 50 years.
And to talk us through this program, we're joined by Dr. Jim Irons, who has recently retired, but was the director of the Earth Science Division at NASA Goddard. He is a recipient of the NASA Distinguished Service Medal, which is the highest honor the agency confers. We're also joined by Dr. Jeff Masek, who has been a Landsat 9 project scientist since 2015.
Okay, we're off to a good start. Play it cool.
Thank you for joining us. We'll start with a question for Dr. Irons. So we love a good scene-setting question. Can you discuss what factors led to the creation of the ERTS, the Earth Resources Technology Satellite Program, which is later known as the Landsat program, and how far back does its heritage go?
Its heritage goes back really to the early 60s. When NASA began launching satellites in the Hertz and Nimbus series, principally for atmospheric observations, to support weather forecasting and meteorological research. A few visionaries, however, in the late 60s, after viewing photographs taken by astronauts in orbit around the Earth with handheld cameras, began to realize that it would be possible to image the surface of the Earth as well from space. And the U.S. Geological Survey, the head of it at that time, named William Pecora, or Bill Pecora, began to advocate for a satellite program that he called the Earth Resources Technology Satellite Program, or ERTS, with his boss, Secretary of the Interior Stuart Udall. They began to propose and advocate for a system designed to image repeatedly the continental and coastal surfaces of the Earth. After some programmatics and politics, the U.S. government finally decided that NASA had the expertise to build and launch satellites for such a purpose, and started to design what was called ERTS, which later became Landsat 1.
Back then, in 1972, you kind of touched on this in the first question. Landsat was based on the design of another satellite, pretty markedly. It was based on Nimbus, which was a weather satellite program.
Right.
Why was that? Nowadays, I want to emphasize Landsat is designed by, I think, Northrop Grumman Innovative Systems. It no longer looks like Nimbus. But can you tell us a little bit about why was that in the beginning?
The reason was the satellite itself, in the jargon of NASA and the aerospace industry, is often called the spacecraft bus. And it provides power and navigation and stabilization for the instruments that are flown as the payload. And NASA had a lot of experience with that particular satellite bus because of the Nimbus program. And the difference was different instruments were designed to be carried aboard that spacecraft bus, different than those that were designed for the meteorological observations of the atmosphere. NASA knew that bus worked well, particularly in a polar orbit. The decision was made to continue to use that Nimbus bus to carry the ERTS or the Landsat instruments.
Yeah, it's probably worth adding that in space flight, you don't have to redesign something. It's probably better to use something that already works. It's been tested and proven. Very often we have to design new instruments, but if we can get away with using a bus, then we'll definitely do it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm glad you mentioned the polar orbit. So here we go with some naivety on my part here, but we'll do our best. So far there have been 9 Landsat satellites, although 1 failed to reach orbit. So 8. And 3 are currently active. Bear in mind, I am a complete novice when it comes to orbital mechanics, I think would be the expression, maybe not. Can you explain how high they are and what kind of orbit enables them to gather the best data?
First of all, they're 705 kilometers in altitude, and they're in a near polar orbit such that the Earth is rotating under them. And the particular orbit they're in is called a sun-synchronous orbit. So every time one of the satellites passes over the equator, the sun is in basically the same position. So you get the same illumination conditions on the ground for every observation. And that's really critical for an imaging satellite. And so in particular case of Landsat at 705 kilometer orbit, 98-degree inclination, we were able to image the same spot on the Earth every 16 days. So we have a repeating ground track on the Earth every 16 days from one satellite. As you say, we have usually 2 on orbit at any one time, and that gives us an 8-day repeating cycle.
All right. We're going to move forward a lot in time. So what discoveries about Earth trends has Landsat made that you think are the most important and will be most remembered?
Jim, do you want to start?
Well, I'll start, and I'll caveat my answer by saying there are so many, we don't have enough time to go through them. But there's a number of outstanding examples. A lot of the early work with Landsat data, the purpose was to map the agricultural areas of the Earth and determine what had been planted and what was growing across the globe. And this was used in order to help commodity reports that the USDA, Foreign Agricultural Service, releases quarterly. So up to then, they had principally using field surveys and reports from country and county agents to determine what was planted and what kind of shape was it in as it was growing in order to help commodity investing. And Landsat provided the first global views of agricultural areas across the earth to help with that process. And the National Agricultural Statistical Service in the US and the Foreign Agricultural Service in the US Department of Agriculture continue to use Landsat data and other data for that purpose today. Moving on into the 80s and early 90s, Landsat data provided the first accurate determinations of the rate of rainforest deforestation in Amazonia and across the belt of rainforests around the equator. So that's very important. It's still used today to look at the impact on rainforests of conversion to agriculture and look at forest disturbance and other forest ecosystems. Other examples, Landsat data have been used to monitor glacial retreat, as virtually all, or almost all, of our glaciers around the world are retreating as a result of global warming. So Landsat data are used to monitor that process over, a 5-decade-long time scale. Jeff, why don't you jump in with a few more examples, since I stole your thunder and forest disturbance?
No, it's fine. I mean, so I guess if you wanted to look at it over a long term, Landsat was just maybe originally designed to inventory natural resources, and it's still used for that, as Jim said. But increasingly, when you think about trends, you're thinking about responses of the planet to climate change. And so Landsat has been used in recent decades to look at the effect of climate change on ecosystems, on ice caps, glacier flow, retreat of mountain glaciers, as Jim indicated, coral reef bleaching. And so the particular question depends in part on where you're looking. In the Russian Far East, people have documented the replacement of large trees by pine trees due to climate change. In the southwestern US, it's the dieback pinyon juniper forests. In the Arctic, it's the advance of tundra, the greening of tundra. Taken together, it basically provides what we think of as a family photo album. It's a snapshot through time of how the planet is changing over the last 50 years. I also tend to think of Landsat, I always call it a Swiss Army knife, because unlike many NASA missions, it doesn't have just one science question it's trying to answer. It's really foundational for a whole variety of geology, land cover, hydrology applications.
Okay, so my mind is going off in 1,000 different directions listening to how you talk. How easy is it for anyone to go on and access this data? Is there a place where someone can pick one spot on Earth and see 50 years of change on that one, a time lapse of change on that one spot? Do you have to apply for that information, or is it just there for anyone to be able to access?
So this is a good spot to remind ourselves that Landsat is a partnership between NASA, which builds and launches the satellites, and the U.S. Geological Survey that actually distributes the data and operates the satellites once they're on orbit. And so USGS processes the data and makes the data available to anyone on what we call a non-discriminatory basis. So anybody can go into their web interface, search for an image, pull it off for free. If you want to get a time series of 50 years, you can do that. You can pull off hundreds of images that are required every 16 days from some locations. And then you can put that time series together to look at the trends in vegetation or hydrology and what have you. In addition, a lot of people are now taking on that role through private cloud computing environments. And so, for example, Google has what they call Google Earth Engine, where they have all of the data obtained from USGS put into their cloud environment, and you can apply algorithms against that entire archive. And in literally, a minute or two, pull up a time series for your state or province and get that 50-year record right in front of you. So it's pretty amazing technology now that allows that.
In 2008, USGS made what I consider an institutionally brave decision to distribute the data at no cost to anybody who requests the data. So there used to be a charge for the data, and now it's freely available. And the USGS and some of these private cloud operators are working to make the data more accessible to people, so that you don't have to be an expert necessarily to download and create a time series or otherwise analyze the data. And USGS is working towards what they call an analysis-ready data set. There's been a real evolution of ease of access for the data, so you don't necessarily have to be a total expert to be able to access and use the data.
That data, is that just of the US, or can someone contact about any area in the world? That must cause some headaches with the Foreign Office, I'm sure. And secondly, what size are the photos? How big is the area that's photographed with each pass over?
Right. So a single Landsat image is 185 by 180 kilometers.
Right.
So you get maybe for our area, the better part of the state of Maryland, for example, would be an example. The resolution of Landsat is about 30 meters on the ground. So each pixel is about the size of a baseball diamond, for comparison. That also means that it's not a spy satellite. And so the other part of your question was, is Landsat just over the US or is it global? It's completely global. And you can get data from anywhere in the world, and there's no prohibition on either imaging parts of the world or getting the data once they're acquired from anybody. But at 30-meter resolution, we're not looking at license plates, right? We're looking at farm fields, we're looking at forest stands, and so forth. And so, if you're interested in espionage, Landsat's probably not the tool that you're after.
Are there any other Earth remote sensing programs that have augmented Landsat's discoveries throughout the decades? And I'm curious, from a historical perspective, in the early years of Landsat, what did it take to get some of the imagery for it? Because I've looked at some of the early Landsat imagery, and it's surprisingly really detailed. You think, oh, it's in the 70s, it's going to be low res, and stuff like that, but it's really pretty good. Can you tell us a little bit about those things?
The Landsat instruments have always collected digital data. So just like a digital camera now, the data have always been digital. And back in the 70s, a lot of people were not accustomed to using digital data. They didn't have digital cameras, didn't have JPEG images, didn't have Photoshop. So a lot of the early analyses were performed by creating images from the digital data and then people doing visual photo interpretation on them. Gradually, the ability to apply computer-aided analyses of the digital data emerged. One of the earliest conferences in the 70s that featured the use of Landsat data was held at Purdue University every year, and it was called, it was computer processing of remote sensing data. And that was like a new thing. The analyses progressed from visual image analysis to computer-aided analyses. And now with high performance computers and cloud computing, the data can be used across, continental to even global size areas. And these time series analyses that Jeff mentioned can be performed in ways that were not possible early on. Until the mid 1980s, Landsat was really the only game in town for satellite observations of ground surfaces. Then the French launched a system called SPOT, Système Propriétaire de l'Observation de la Terre. I just mangled the French language. They're probably not going to appreciate that. And gradually, other national space agencies began to launch remote sensing satellites. The Indian Remote Sensing Organization, known as ISRO, launched some remote sensing satellites. Recently, the European Space Agency, ESA, has a whole program of Earth-observing satellites they call Copernicus. Part of that program has been satellites called Sentinel-2, which are very Landsat-like in their capabilities and design. And now private companies have emerged that are launching satellites capable of high-resolution imagery. And a lot of their anchor tenants are national security agencies, but they sell their data publicly. So they're producing images with a spatial resolution of a meter or even less. And good examples would be a company called Maxar now. Part of that company used to be called Digital Globe. And another company that's prominent is called Planet, and they've launched I think they call them flocks of CubeSats with very small instruments on them to make frequent sub-meter collections of imagery, across the globe. But there's differences between Landsat and those capabilities, including our attention to sensor calibration. And Landsat instruments have always acquired data for multiple spectral bands, that is, at frequencies that include the visible but go beyond the visible into the near and shortwave infrared portion of the spectrum and out into the thermal longer wave portion of the spectrum.
So the additional imagers that Jim mentioned are all optical imagers. They take images just like Landsat, although at different resolutions and different spectral bands. But there's also sort of a plays well with others element that there are scientific satellites that complement Landsat as well. So a couple of quick examples. For vegetation, we use LiDAR systems to look at the height of vegetation. And you can combine that with the land cover change analysis from Landsat to look at the total amount of carbon being emitted or taken out of the atmosphere. Very important measurement. Similarly, we have gravity satellites that are able to look at groundwater withdrawal. So you can couple the land use analysis that comes out of Landsat with the effects on groundwater from other satellites. So there's a lot that can be done by combining different modalities of observation.
That is so cool. Yeah, I just read, I just pulled up an article in the Landsat, the USGS website, and it was like, yeah, if you have a smartphone, you've got Landsat on your phone. And I was like, I never, obviously I knew that, but I never thought of it that way, like, wow, that's, because I remember as a kid, you had to go like to a specific place and get all the pictures and stuff like that. And now it's like, oh, it's all on your phone. Of course.
Yeah, of course. Now, we've had a couple of questions from some of our Patreon subscribers. One is from Leo Hilsendegger, and he asked, how does the satellite technology today compare to 50 years ago in regards to both performance and size? Technology has obviously enabled things to get much smaller, but does that mean you send a smaller satellite, or do you just have more tools on each one? You mentioned buses earlier and things like that. So I know things have changed quite a lot, but I just wondered if there was some clear and obvious examples you could share.
Well, the size of the instruments has been able to shrink quite a bit for a given resolution and a given number of spectral bands. There are some limits on physics, though, in terms of how small the optics can get while still being able to resolve something on the ground of a certain size. With the diffraction limit, and that's not going to change. What has happened is, for example, the focal planes, just like on your iPhone, you have a focal plane that has a certain number of picture elements or pixels on it. And those have shrunk and become much more capable over the years and have really been able to drive the size of instrumentation down. So that is something that we're looking at for future Landsats, is taking advantage of those technology innovations and being able to both shrink the size of the instruments, which allows a smaller platform, which allows you to launch multiple platforms at once, for example, or use a smaller rocket and save some money, but also just allowing more spectral bands as well.
And you've kind of just touched on it there as well. So the other question we had is from Daniel Gillies, who asked, what comes next? What's the future of Earth observation, and what does that look like? And I'd like to focus that more on Landsat. Obviously, Landsat 9 went up last year. So is the plan just to keep rolling them out, or do you think private enterprise will take over that so that Landsat doesn't have to be a government thing anymore? How do you see it in 50 years?
So just to recap the brief recent history, Landsat 9 was a basically direct copy of Landsat 8. Which took advantage of the fact we had some spare parts left over.
Nice.
Landsat 10, which is currently called Landsat Next, That's still under discussion as far as what the architecture is going to look like, but the draft requirements that have been put out for comment envision, I think, a much more capable system with a spatial resolution down from 30 meters down to 10 meters and 26 spectral bands instead of the current 10 or 11. And a higher temporal revisit as well, which is something the community has really been looking for. Even 8-day revisit with 2 satellites is not enough to be able to capture things on the ground that are changing every day. So we're trying to meet that need with Landsat Next. The second part of your question was sort of the policy question, which is what is the relative role of a government system versus a private enterprise? Now that private remote sensing systems are becoming more common and more capable. As Jim said earlier, the spectral coverage of Landsat is unique, and it's not, at this time at least, replicated within the private commercial remote sensing systems, going out into the shortwave infrared and into the thermal infrared. You need larger instruments and more capable instruments to be able to image out in those areas. And at the moment, there isn't the commercial market to do it. Mm. So there is a unique role for Landsat and its science capabilities. As Jim also said earlier, Landsat is very carefully calibrated, right? So we match the observations on the satellite to physical measurements of either surface reflectance or surface temperature, depending on which band you're looking at. And that's extremely important. If you're trying to do this 50-year-long record, you want to make sure that what's changing is the Earth below you and not the instrumentation, because you can badly misinterpret a satellite record that way. So for those reasons, we think that there is the need for a government sort of common good baseline system, but upon which the commercial systems can sort of add on and add capability.
Yeah, your question goes back decades. In the 80s, operations of Landsat 4 and Landsat 5 after launch were transferred to a private company called EOSat. That transfer was initiated under the Carter administration and followed through by the Reagan administration. So it was a bipartisan effort. And during the years in which Landsat 4 and Landsat 5 were operated, it didn't work out well for a number of reasons. The cost of the data became prohibitive. Really, hardly anybody could afford the prices that were being charged. Data collection was not systematic. Basically, the instruments would be turned off unless they had a customer for the data. Calibration was not carefully maintained. And then the private company was responsible in collaboration with NOAA for launching Landsat 6, which failed to achieve orbit. So all those things worked against the business case for that commercialization. And in 1992, a law was passed, Remote Sensing Policy Act, which returned responsibility for building, launching, and operating Landsat 7 to the U.S. government. After some a little bit of a convolution, it came down to NASA building and launching Landsat 7 and USGS assuming responsibility for operations and for collecting and preserving the data. And so as we go into the future, it was addressed. We attempted to address some commercialization again as we formulated what's now Landsat 8. That didn't work out. I'll say we, I hope I'm not speaking for Jeff, that we think that Landsat is complementary to all the other capabilities that are being built and operated by both commercial and foreign national partners. But you have to think, is there a business case for maintaining an archive and distributing data at no cost that goes back 50 years or 100 years, which is the kind of time frame that's required to try to see the signal of climate change. And, you know, I think Jeff and I are both firmly in the camp that there's a role for the federal government in continuing Landsat operations and not turning it over as a private or even an international effort.
Absolutely. The opportunities to generate goodwill from this project with countries around the world, it must have been huge. It's one of those projects which can only really unite people, in my opinion. But I imagine also there's a fair amount of criticism from people who just don't believe. How frustrating is all of that stuff for you guys as people are working with it, when people just say, well, let's not get too deep into it, but how frustrating is it when you hear things like that?
You mean the people are skeptical about climate change? And
yes.
Yeah. Well, at NASA, our job is to provide information for informed policy decisions. And so we are directed to stay out of policy and just continue to make the observations that maybe make some policy decisions that are, in our opinion, obvious, but they're not our decisions. I think it's important for us to continue to make accurate, credible observations that are available to the public. And there was a survey done by NPR about 5 years, National Public Radio, about 5 years ago. It came out to say something like that the NASA was the most credible federal agency when it came to climate change in the U.S. And so we maintain that by being very rigorous in how we obtain and analyze observations from space, from the high vantage point of space. That's our role. So personally, do I get frustrated? Yeah, but I'm gratified to have been part of a program that continues to make credible observations so that we can provide the evidence, irrefutable evidence of ongoing climate change, and let the policymakers decide what to do after that. Also, I wanted to mention, when you spoke of goodwill, the Landsat satellites continue to directly downlink and have since Landsat 1 data to a network of international ground stations. So other foreign nations can have direct access to the data that goes right to their ground station within their countries, and be able to use that data as they see fit. So it's always been a ambassador of goodwill. The program has been an ambassador of goodwill, I think, since its inception.
I think that leads us on nicely to this question, which is, how do you think Landsat will be remembered in 100 years?
There aren't that many scientific monitoring programs that last that long. Maybe some of the ice cap drilling projects and weather stations and so forth. But I think the Landsat is in that same class, providing a long-term picture of how the planet is changing that's completely unique. I think also the visual element of Landsat is very important. I think you may be able to argue with climate change, for example, but what you can't argue about is the picture of deforestation across the Amazon over the last 40, 50 years. So providing an objective and irrefutable view of how Earth's environments are changing, I think is absolutely critical. And I think that's, that baseline, that benchmark is going to be how Landsat is remembered.
I think we sometimes also forget about just how stunningly beautiful the surface of the Earth is as observed from space. Well, we do focus on a lot of the problems that are occurring due to natural and man-made change. But USGS has a website called Earth is Art, which is predominantly consists of Landsat images that have been rendered in a way that really brings out, just the natural beauty and the awe of observing the Earth from space. So I hope that the Landsat program I hope it is remembered for the unique information that it's provided and how it really revolutionized our ability to study the Earth. But I also hope people remember that, wow, it's really stunning when you look at the Earth from that high of a vantage point.
Yeah, there was an article in the Atlantic about 5 or 6 years ago by Robinson Mayer, and he had a great sentence. I'm paraphrasing, but it was something like, if the idea that satellites are aloft taking pictures of the planet every day, if that seems self-evident, it's only because Landsat made it so. It certainly wasn't self-evident that would be the case in 1972, and it certainly wasn't self-evident that would grow and prosper and sort of last for the next 50 or 100 years. So yeah, Landsat will also be remembered as a pioneer.
In closing out, Landsat, obviously it debuted in 1972. And, that was sort of a weird transitional time for spaceflight, because you were, especially people who, weren't really plugged into, I should say, like robotic spaceflight. People viewed it as, oh God, the moon landings are ending and, and NASA's shutting down, I think. So it's my personal belief that Landsat never really got its recognition that it really deserved, because it's not, and I'm not trying to, poo-poo the Apollo program, but it's, it's not landing on the moon. It's not as glamorous, I guess. So do you think it's time that, Landsat finally gets, the recognition it really deserves?
Short answer would be yes. At NASA, we work very conscientiously on what we call outreach. So we want the public to both understand what we do, how we do it, and why it's important. And part of that is self-serving in that we require public tax dollar funding of our programs, and we try to make sure that the public understands that they're getting value for the tax dollars that have been spent on the program. But also it's partly educational. We just want people. We're motivated by helping people understand the Earth and how it works and how it's changing over time. Because Landsat provides, and our other Earth observing systems provide important, credible, reliable data. We want people to view it as such. So, yeah, we would like to Landsat and the other Earth science observational programs that we promote or that we develop at NASA to be recognized for their value and what they're providing.
I think you kind of referenced this earlier, that obviously Google comes in, makes Google Earth an app, and most people probably think that Google put satellites up there and took all these photos, and it doesn't say powered by Landsat. Does that frustrate you as well? I'm just trying to find out how frustrated you are. Is that something that you think that perhaps it's a NASA job, but perhaps it's people like mine and Emily's job to make people aware? This is why we have all of this cool stuff now. Does it frustrate you?
Yes. I mean, I do think Google, if you look at the bottom of their Google Maps, for example, you see that the satellite image comes from Landsat. It says they're courtesy of U.S. Geological Survey or something like that. But, in general, I think, as Jim said, not everybody even realizes that NASA has an Earth science program, let alone Landsat. I think people are going to hear a lot about Landsat this year. It is the 50th anniversary. There's a lot of press that's going to happen, your podcast included. And so it's a good opportunity to remind people that, the government has had this program for the last 5 decades and will continue to monitor the planet. So sometimes it gets frustrating, but we just keep getting the message out.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I often see on the news, satellite data. You can ask my wife, I'll be yelling, that's Landsat data. And it's why I think we enjoy having the opportunity to talk to people like you to try to get the message out. So, and I also put in a plug that all of the successfully launched Landsat satellites, the development of those satellites and the launch of those satellites were all managed by NASA Goddard Spaceflight Center, where Jeff and I worked in Greenbelt, Maryland. And we're pretty proud of that record, I think. Obviously, it's nice to get that recognition. But the most important thing really is to have that information highly regarded and available to people.
Absolutely. I imagine JPL get all the plaudits for all the stuff they do that gets all the headlines, but you guys at Goddard go under the radar a little bit. But thank you so much for joining us today to talk about it and open our eyes to it, and hopefully some of our listeners as well who may not have ever heard of Landsat before this episode, but would definitely have been aware of it, but just not aware of it. Something like that.
Exactly.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I enjoyed talking to you. I'm sure I can speak for Jeff and say we enjoyed talking to you.
It's been great. Thanks.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this was really cool. Thank you.
This operation is somewhat like the periscope of a submarine. All you see is the three of us, but beneath the surface are thousands and thousands of others. To all those, I would like to say thank you very much.
Man, this program just doesn't get the recognition, does it?
No, it doesn't. That's the thing. I think it came out, it debuted. Unfortunately, I mean, this is just my take on it. I could be wrong. If any space historians have another take on this, that's fine. Please contact us and we'll entertain it. But I think it came out during sort of a weird transitional period for just NASA in general. 1972, the moon landings were ending, Skylab was starting. Yep, I got it in, and it just was kind of a weird period. And I think, not to poo-poo the Apollo program, but, it wasn't seen as glamorous as the Apollo program.
Walking on the moon.
Yeah. If you look at the Landsat imagery from the early 70s, I mean, for the time it was taken, it's mind-blowing. I mean, it's actually quite detailed, considering, they didn't have the kind of digital imagery technology that we have now. As a kid, I had a poster, I was a nerd, but I had a Landsat, a poster on my wall because I thought it was cool. It's my personal feeling that I don't think Landsat's ever got its moment. I think we've just kind of taken it for granted.
It's connecting the dots, isn't it, that you have to do in your own head? Because obviously, Landsat isn't the only images of Earth we've ever had, but a lot of the science we see and things like Google Earth and stuff like that have come from that. And you have to connect the dots between what you see on your screen or on the news or whatever with the idea that this has come from Landsat. And the word Landsat doesn't often get put with those images or whenever this data is put out there. So it's easy to forget that that's where it's come from or that this program has that value. There's probably so many people that just aren't even aware of its existence.
Exactly.
Even though, as I said at the end, they are aware of it. Of course they're aware of it. We love an unsung hero on this podcast. This is an unsung hero. This is an absolute unsung hero. As Jim said, it was a pioneer. When they started this, they didn't say, in 50 years' time, we'll have this record of all these different areas from 50 years taken with exactly the same settings, and we know exactly the settings that each thing was done, so we can do an absolute comparison from 1972 to 2022 and have that visual comparison.
Yeah.
That wasn't actually what was thought would happen, and that is what's happened. It's a wonderful program that we should be proud of and we should celebrate. And there's part of me that thinks we shouldn't allow things like Google to come in and take the credit for it. And may say it at the bottom, but it's such a huge thing. And Goddard doesn't get the credit it does.
No,
how many
doesn't.
people even know about NASA Goddard? Most people would have heard of Houston. They would have heard of KSC. They would have heard of JPL.
Exactly. Yeah. A lot of people don't think of, NASA Goddard as being, part of the equation. Yeah, you hear of JPL. When you think of robotic spacecraft, right?
You think JPL.
And like I said during the interview, it's on our phones. We don't even realize it's on our phone. Yeah. We don't even think about it, but it's there. It's incredible that we have access to that data just now at our fingertips. And Landsat really was the beginning of that, which is something that really should be celebrated.
Absolutely. So happy birthday, Landsat. Happy 50th birthday.
Yes.
Long may you reign over us.
Yeah. If it were not for my naughty ass cats, that would probably rip it down. I would try to find that poster and get it put on my wall. It was awesome. They did discuss this during the interview, but there's this USGS website. I think it's by the USGS. It's called Earth is Art. The pictures from that,
stunning. Yeah,
they're functional. They serve a purpose, but they're exquisite. And I think pictures really speak to people emotionally. And I think if more people dug into that imagery, they'd get more pumped up over it.
Yeah, it's the age-old thing that you and I have talked about many times with many different topics of how do we make this sexy? How do we sell this to people?
How do we make it interesting?
Glamorous. Yeah, how do we make it interesting? How do we make sure that people are aware of it? And, as I said in the thing, it's down to us as much as it's down to NASA. Everyone who likes these things needs to remind people, hey, you should find out about this. There's a whole other episode we need to do on GPS, which is another similar program, which, we so take for granted, but is absolutely one of the powerhouses of what goes on up there in terms of affecting our daily life.
We could do that, because that's another thing. Nope, it's on your phone, but you don't think about it. Yeah, you're like, oh, I'll just, type this in. I don't know where, I used it this weekend. When you get to sit down and think, you're like, a satellite got in touch with my phone and allowed me to do that. Yeah. That's mind-blowing. I mean, imagine, 40 years ago, if somebody told you that, like, you're going to have this little thing.
Forget 40 years ago, even 15 years ago, or 20,
You're exactly right.
20 years ago. Like, when did the smartphone first came out? I think I got my first iPhone in 2009, 2010.
Yeah.
I think it was 2010. Before that, I didn't have a map on my phone. I had to look up directions for places. Even then, I was using the internet, so I was still using GPS.
I had to print them.
Yeah, you did. You walked around with a piece of paper and printed directions on it. You absolutely
I had
did.
to print them out, and then sometimes I'd print out a map, from the internet, like a little map, and then I'd have the steps printed out, and then you had to look at the paper while you were driving.
Yeah. Yeah, you definitely couldn't choose a voice to tell you which way to go.
Yeah, you couldn't choose a voice. You had to look at this damn paper. Sometimes I would clip it above my head and just look up if I had to. I'm like, that was just cumbersome, I mean, back in my day, it was really tough.
It wasn't that long ago. That's the crazy thing, isn't it? Where are we going to be with this in 30, 40 years' time? I just think it's quite something. And I hope that Landsat certainly gets celebrated over the course of this year for its achievements. And as always, the full interview will be up on our Patreon page for those of you who'd like to watch our reactions or just watch that all happening without me taking my scissors to it. And you can find that on patreon.com/space and things.
Do we see you waving? Hey, this is great. Hello, Mom. Great to see you, Ron. Looking great. Okay. Hey, John, how you doing?
So, since Emily and I last recorded, there have been 6 launches in 6 locations: Russia, Florida, California, China, New Zealand, and French Guiana. And details of all those launches and their payloads, along with videos, if they exist, will be in our show notes, which you can find on spaceandthingspodcast.com or by clicking the link in the description of this episode in your podcast provider. The launch in French Guiana was the first launch of the European Space Agency's Vega C rocket, which has some pretty big upgrades from the original Vega rocket, which the agency has been using since 2012. So that was pretty cool.
Yes. As we mentioned right at the top of the show, the main event this week has been the publishing of the first photos from the James Webb Space Telescope. Now, I'm sure you've all seen them by now, but if not, go find them and they will absolutely take your breath away. On Monday, July 11th, President Joe Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, and NASA Administrator Bill Nelson unveiled the first science quality image, captured by the telescope. And it is the deepest infrared view of the universe to date and was created in just 12 and a half hours of observing time on one of the telescope's instruments. The image is quite spectacular, and despite all the things held within it, it covers just a tiny amount of the night sky. Bill Nelson said that if you held a grain of sand on the tip of your finger at arm's length, that is the part of the universe that you're seeing, just one little speck of the universe. That is, I feel like crying just reading that. That's so unbelievable. On Tuesday, NASA released 3 other photos in a spectrum, which is a representation of the amount of different wavelengths of light emitted by an exoplanet dubbed WASP-96b. First discovered in 2013, this spectrum has given us new information on the composition of the planet, which is 1,150 light years away. Around where the
just around the corner.
4th Street Starbucks.
Yeah.
This release is something that we've been waiting on patiently for since the telescope launched on Christmas Day and is the start of a new phase of scientific study of our universe. If these images are anything to go by, this telescope is going to be worth every penny and every delay that took place en route to getting it into space.
I don't know what it's been like in America, but the coverage here has been huge, given everything that's going on in this country at the moment. It's great to see that it's made the front pages. It's something we've worried about for a while, whether this would get the kudos it deserved. But these images have done exactly what we hoped, right?
Yeah, I like I said earlier, I just feel like crying thinking about it. I think images are very emotional for people. Like Hubble, it was the same way. When we saw the first good images from Hubble after it was fixed, you saw the images and you're like, oh my God, and this is like 10 times the Hubble. I mean, I kind of hate the comparisons to Hubble because Webb is primarily infrared, but still, and I think the telescopes both are amazing in their own right. And Hubble has certainly had an incredible 30 plus years in operation, but it just brought up a lot of emotions. You really think like, man, we're not even a speck in the universe. We're like a microscopic, almost invisible piece of the universe. I mean, we're not alone out there. It was just mind blowing to even think about it.
Absolutely. I saw the first image. I was like, oh, wow, that's cool. I wonder how much of the sky that actually uses. And then to find out it's just a grain of rice at arm's length, you're like, what? That's all that's there? No, that can't be right.
Space is huge.
Yeah. I mean, what was it you put on Facebook? Next time you're arguing with someone on the internet,
send them that have a picture. Yeah. Just send them that picture.
Yeah. Remember how insignificant you are.
Yeah. Remember how like insignificant this argument is, Yeah. I mean, seriously, because like we're like a microscopic part of the universe. I mean, we're at the, as Jay Galentine would have said, at the electrons moving stage. We're just such a small part. And I think everybody who has seen these photos has gotten kind of like an overview effect from them. I don't know if that's the right term, but sort of like we're really not as big as we thought we were. I don't know how to describe it. All I can say is I think these discoveries, we just haven't seen anything yet. It's going to be like Hubble, where it just unfolds over the decades and we're just like amazed,
I agree. It's the start, isn't it? And that's what's so wonderful about it. So yeah, I have actually enjoyed all the comparisons, by the way, with Hubble. Yeah. I know it's a little bit unfair because they're completely different.
Hubble was started getting designed in the 70s. So you got to figure it's old tech.
Exactly. But I think it's still interesting for people who don't know the ins and outs of what's going on. I think it's interesting for them just to say, oh, right, this shows the step up in what we might learn from this compared to Hubble about those places. It doesn't take away anything from Hubble. I just think it just shows really clearly how much more we're going to learn. But it stands on the shoulders of Hubble. I've quite enjoyed it. And I've enjoyed all the memes as well. There's been a lot of great memes. But it's just great to see people talking about it. People who don't normally talk about space on their timelines, I'm seeing talk about these images. And I think that's great. Yeah. That's what we always hope for. And it's happening. So that's great.
Yep, absolutely.
So last week we mentioned that NASA's Capstone moon probe was on its way to the moon, but had gone silent. Well, the good news is that it's phoned home again. Oh, by the way, did you know that E.T. came out 40 years ago this December?
Wow.
Yeah. There you go. Little film reference for you there. Just dropped in. Anyway, the probe also completed its second engine burn on July 12th, and that appears to have been a success. It's going to take a while, as we said last week, to get into this crazy orbit they're trying to get it into around the moon, but hopefully it's had its glitch for this mission, and that's another film reference that I'm sure most of you will have be able to recognize.
I know what film that is. That was like famous last words in that film. Because I remember they said that, and I was like, that's not the last thing that's going to screw up. Wow. Not by far. Okay. Meanwhile, on Mars, Perseverance has collected its 9th and 10th samples while it's exploring an ancient river delta inside Jezero crater. It's also been scouting out some locations for where the probe, which will collect the samples, might land. The photos of these samples are really special. You have to keep reminding yourself that these are from another planet. We have been getting some amazing quality images from Mars for many years now, but it really is an amazing thing what we're doing there.
You know how we always used to get the thing from people who'd say, oh, those images are fake about the moon landing and stuff like that. Yeah. You could so clearly see why people could say that about these photos because they're so crisp and so clear. and they look like they could just be taken around the corner in many ways, but they're not. They're from Mars. It's amazing. Yeah. It's so cool.
Yeah, it's like a several minute delay to even get any of these, or probably longer to get any of these photos, and you just, oh, geez. Space is big.
Yep. And finally, if you are hoping that we might see the first orbital launch of SpaceX Super Heavy Starship rocket this month, well, we may have another delay. A fireball erupted at the base of Booster 7, which is a prototype of the rocket. I'll try and find a video and put it in the show notes, but according to Elon Musk, the company's founder and CEO, it was unintentional. And on Twitter, he said, yeah, actually not good. Team is assessing damage. He then followed it up with a tweet explaining that he had just started an engine spin start test. Hopefully the engines haven't got too much damage.
Yeah, that looked bad. Anyway.
It did look bad, didn't it?
All I got to say about that. Yeah, the shockwave, I was like, oh, damn.
Yes.
That's not good.
Hey, congratulations. This is real good.
That's it for this week. Thanks again for listening and for your support. And thanks for all of your contact this week. It seems that you all really enjoyed our interview with Jay Galentine. A special thanks to Jen for buying a t-shirt this week.
Yep.
We're now just 2 episodes away from our 100th show, and we're still here and not going anywhere.
Absolutely not. And we have some great plans for the future too. So please continue to hit that share button and consider joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/space and things. We have 44 subscribers so far. It would be great to get to 50 by show 100. But don't forget, in space, no one can hear you stream.
Space and Things has been brought to you by And Things Productions.